Hi there, my name is Jessie McDowell, and today we're going to be talking about multimedia. There's actually a lot of complex research and studies and theories that go into not only designing multimedia, but how to actually implement those effectively in the classroom to support learning and student success rather than distracting from that learning and success. So, we're going to dive into some of the basic principles, what multimedia is, and then how you can actually use it in your classrooms. First, we're going to look at an overview of what multimedia actually is. It has a hardware component and a software component put together. Most of the time, the hardware side looks like a projector that's being displayed to the entire class, or it could be individual devices such as mobile devices, student laptops, and tablets. Both of these sides are put together whenever using multimedia. The device is going to show the multimedia to the course or to the class, and then the software side is how it's actually being presented. That could be a simple program such as Microsoft PowerPoint, a Word document, a PDF, interactive videos. It could even be e-learning modules and learning management systems. They do have audio-visual components, and that's what makes it multimedia. There's multiple ways that information is being transmitted and presented to the students. There's a visual component, so things you're actually looking at, and an audio component of things that you're actually going to be listening to. Again, these can vary quite a bit depending on the type of multimedia being used, but overall they tend to have both a auditory and visual component put together. Sometimes they're interactive. Again, this can vary as well. It might be simply clicking the next and previous buttons to see different pages of multimedia. It could be playing videos. It could even be online games that are used in education as well. And obviously they're going to be informative, especially in the education setting, because that's the whole point, right? It's not simply there to be fun or anything like that. It can be fun, but the main purpose is how are we going to present information in a way that makes sense to students and helps them actually remember the content. That's the overall goal of using multimedia. So there are different ways to present or use multimedia in the classroom. Some of the most commonly used ones are e-modules. Those can vary quite a bit. They might have interactive infographics, accordions, or tabs that students can click through. They might have some quiz questions and typically are in a page format. There's also videos. You can find tons of those on YouTube and different educational and teacher websites. Tons of opportunities all over the internet. Assessment. So even assessments can be given to students using multimedia platforms. And also simulations. You have science simulations about lab safety. You could have different procedures, even like a medical situation. You could have science, biology, and chemistry simulations where they're actually clicking through the different elements that they see in the picture, or they're accomplishing certain tasks inside the simulation. So we're going to talk about best practices, and a lot of these are going to revolve today around Richard Mayer's 12 Principles of Multimedia Learning. Some of these might seem kind of stuff that's not new to you, but I guarantee some of these actually will be new. And we're going to frame these in the lens of instructional design and looking at how these principles will actually impact how students learn the actual material. Our first principle is the signaling principle. This is actually one of my favorites. We use this a lot in everyday life without even realizing it. You have your turning signal when you're in traffic to let people know, hey, I'm about to change lanes, I'm going to turn for safety reasons. This next one, I don't even have to show you the entire image, and I bet that you already know what's going on here and what the logo is. This is recognition to say, hey, the advertisements are over and the movie is starting. This is another signal to the audience to pay attention, turn your cell phones off because the movie has officially started. Likewise, there is signaling in education and multimedia, whether it be videos, e-modules, anything like that. The signaling principle is all about highlighting what's important so they can either focus and can filter out things that are more important and prioritize them. And it's also to let them know ahead of time what they need to be focusing on. It gives them a heads up, basically. In this example, you can see that the phrase is highlighted in green. That way it draws your eye to that specific phrase, and you can kind of separate that. And that's a visual cue of, hey, this is the most important aspect on this slide or this page of the module. And similarly, I have little tabs up here at the top. I like doing this for my students because it gives them cues on where we are in the lesson. How much more do we have left? Some of my students will be asking me, how much more do we have to write? And they always try to space out all of their notes that they're writing to make sure they can fit it on one page, etc. So the more you can give signaling of what's important, what's coming next, the flow of the lesson, then the better off your students are going to be. So here's an example of an instructional video that I have made for one of my animation courses. And the goal here was to break down artwork to find the basic shapes. And here we're trying to find the basic rectangles. And this is how I use signaling to draw their eyes to those locations.
I see the stack of books, the cat's graduation cap, the stripes on the boy's scarf, and part of the mugs down here.
So pretty simple. Those are ways that you can draw their eye or their attention to a specific piece. Let's look at another example from the same video, and we're talking about a specific panel and a specific toolbar in a program that has lots of buttons and menus and everything. So I'm trying to make sure I am being very intentional, highlighting arrows, signaling to them what I'm talking about and what's important.
First, we're going to look at the Illustrator screen, and let's focus on the left-hand side, and that's going to be called our toolbar. In this tools panel, we're going to be looking specifically at the rectangle tool, which literally just looks like a rectangle.
So that's a couple different ways I signaled all in one scene. With PowerPoint specifically, a couple of ideas are labeling, like 1 of 5, 2 of 10, the progression of your slides or content. You could always have a next with the next topic at the bottom to alert your students that you're going to be going to the next topic. So if they have any questions, they should ask them now. Verbal cues. You could say, before we move on to the next topic, do you have any questions? Or to summarize this portion of the presentation, or maybe on an e-module, that could be a summary slide or an overview slide. And then you also have tabs similar to what I have in this presentation. Signaling with information can be hierarchies, kind of like an outline. So bullet points, you can see that I have some yellow text that stands out as the overall categories here, and then the sub information has a different color, same font, so it's not distracting, but it's indented and has bullet points, so it's easy to read. You can make differences that will stand out to them if you highlight certain text, different fonts. You can have arrows, different animations that will draw their eye as well. Next is a contiguity principle. With this one, you're making sure that the graphics and the text that you're using are co-located. Not only is that mentally going to make more sense, but it's going to limit the amount of time that your students' eyes are going to be tracking to different areas of the screen. You want it to be mentally and visually really coherent and streamlined on how they're looking and absorbing the information. So if you have information scattered all over, and let's say you have step 1 over here, step 2 over there, and the picture that goes to step 2 is over here by step 1, that's going to be extra processing that their brain has to do to make sense of the information that you're presenting. Additionally, this one basically makes sense, and I feel like most of us try to ensure that our visuals that are on the screen are matching the narration that we've recorded. It doesn't make sense for me right now to be talking about signaling whenever we are talking about a different principle on this slide. So again, it's pretty foundational, but if we don't focus on these basics, then that's going to distract our students and potentially cause some issues. They're going to be so distracted by things that don't line up, and they're not going to be paying attention to the actual material. It's kind of like those foreign movies where you put on English subtitles, but it doesn't match the actors' mouths whenever they're talking. I can understand what's going on because I can read the subtitles, but it's so distracting because I'm trying to match what I'm reading with what I'm hearing, and they're two different things. Next is the redundancy principle. With the redundancy principle, we're looking at how many different ways are we presenting information to students. If we have graphics and narration, that's the best way you want to go. I'm narrating this video, obviously, so I don't have a lot of text that's word for word saying everything that I'm saying. I don't need to do that because I'm already giving you auditory information. And then visually, you can look at the graphics, put the two together in your mind, and you can tell what I'm trying to convey to you in the information. If I had a lot of text on these slides and I'm talking to you and I have graphics, that's going to be a lot of overload for your brain. Take a look at this guy. Now, if I took this off the screen and I said, what stood out to you after 10 seconds, you probably couldn't tell me what stood out to you because everything stands out to you. That's because there's a lot of stuff going on here, and that's just visual. What if we also had narration and we had subtitles? If I added subtitles on top of a really, really busy infographic, that would be a lot of mental overloading going on. And then imagine all these components being animated. It'd be really difficult to glean any information because it's an overload. What about this one? What if next to this picture I had 4 big paragraphs of information on the slide? I am reading those paragraphs to you, and there's subtitles, and there's text, and there's a picture. That is simply going to be too much. That's why when you look at documentaries, they tend to have just the narration, right? Because it's a documentary, but they have a lot of videos that will connect and relate to what they're talking about and really minimize the amount of text that they use. And if you think about it, a lot of times if they present a document, let's say a historical video is talking about the Declaration of Independence, it will show the document, but it tends to zoom out or just briefly show it to the point that the audience is not trying to read the words. Or if they do read the words off of the document, they will pause. And oftentimes I will zoom in on a specific phrase and highlight it for the audience before moving on to the next scene. I've mentioned cognitive load a little bit, and that is a big piece of redundancy. There's 3 different channels where we are presenting and absorbing information, basically mental channels. We have graphics, so we're looking at the different graphics, we're noticing the colors, how the graphic relates to other information, and whether that graphic makes sense to me. We have audio, whether that be music that's in the background. You could have narration, maybe it's the audio that comes with a video. And then you have the text as well. So that could be text that's integrated into a graphic, or it could be written text, like the bullet points on this slide. The thing you need to be careful with is each one of these channels, whenever you keep adding more and more into the same page, the same slide, the same portion of your multimedia, it kind of looks like this cup over here. You keep filling up each one of these channels, and you have working memory and you have long-term memory. Whenever you are in class and you're presenting new information, we are working within that working memory, which is limited. So once that cup is full, it's going to start overflowing, and all that information you wanted your students to learn is going to go in one ear and out the other. There's different types of cognitive load. One of them is intrinsic, and these are important things to consider whenever you either select or design your multimedia for your courses. Intrinsic load talks about the student on the inside. So does the student consider this topic or this information complex? If they see it as an easy subject that's easy for them to pick up, it won't be a problem. But as Anderson and McCransky in their 2020 study saw, the more complex the students perceived the content to be, the more of a mental load it was on them individually compared to other students. Oren and Ackbolt in their 2019 study found that students with prior knowledge didn't have to rely on their working memory as much because they had the information in their long term memory, which meant their overall cognitive load that's taxing them is actually lower compared to other students without that prior knowledge. And that could be, maybe they learned different principles in Algebra 1 that they can apply in Algebra 2. Maybe that's something inside the same course where Chapter 1 builds as it goes throughout the course and is again mentioned in Chapter 5. So it could be a lot of different ways that prior knowledge is acquired, but that definitely makes a difference. And if they have experience with technology, that also helps. Students that are not used to operating computers, tablets, etc., to actually operate this multimedia are going to have more of a cognitive load because they're having to think about things like operating a mouse, a keyboard, etc. The extrinsic load, that's coming from outside the student. And a lot of that comes from course design, whether the instructions are clear, the multimedia that we're using, if it doesn't take signaling and contiguity and other principles into mind whenever we're designing these courses, then this will actually cause a heavier cognitive load on these students. So if it's not designed appropriately, they're going to have more of that cognitive load simply because they're trying to keep up with all the overlapping signals and the overflowing cup that we're giving them based on how the course was designed. And an interesting study from 2019 by Oren and Ackbolt talked about the different tasks and multitasking. And I thought it was interesting because so many times as educators, we will say, take notes while we're doing this, accomplish and fill out this worksheet while you're doing that, multitask. And they found that even the younger generation that we have now, even though we perceive them to have better multitasking skills because they grew up with technology, that's actually not the case and not proven by research or science. They have just a harder time multitasking as we do. And that's because your brain has these certain channels, and if you're multitasking, you're having to swap in between the two. You actually can't do two things at the same time. So the type of multitasking is also important to note. And in their 2019 study, they looked at different students who were either concurrently multitasking, so doing something at the same time as a lecture or watching a video that's educational, and then sequential multitasking, where they said, okay, watch this video and then write some key points and then do this and then do that in a sequential order. And they found that sequential multitasking was actually a lot more helpful with retention of information than the concurrent multitasking. Another example, sadly, of the concurrent multitasking is students who love to be on their laptops and cell phones during a lecture. No surprise there, they did find in studies that it dramatically lowered the knowledge retention of students because obviously they're distracted and they're not paying attention to the lecture. So another element of that 2019 study was location. And a lot of studies consider location to be separate cognitive loading from the academic multimedia cognitive load. And this study actually disproved that. They had two separate groups of students, and they were asked to interact with multimedia and a variety of types of multitasking. But one group was in a library, and another group was in a cafeteria. Now, I know what you're thinking. Those are pretty stark differences between the two, but the students who were located in the cafeteria actually had noise canceling headphones in, so it kind of minimized the noise, and they were actually located in a more isolated, not as much foot traffic and people going by area of the cafeteria. So even though it was relatively quiet and less distracting than like being in the middle of the cafeteria, the knowledge retention stayed the same. However, the students self-reported a higher level of cognitive load simply because they're constantly monitoring their surroundings. They're noticing people walking in and out. There's probably smells of the food that's being cooked or cleaning chemicals, doors opening and closing, etc. So even though they had an more isolated location and noise canceling headphones, that was not enough to kind of negate the environment. So, all those things go into the cognitive load that students are experiencing both intrinsically and extrinsically with multimedia. Next, we're going to briefly talk about images and text. And some of these seem a little basic, but these are all best practices and they are all backed by research. So, first, we have that visuals and narrations are more effective and are proven to be more effective than visuals with text. So, if you were looking at this video and all it had was these slides being clicked through, and my narration of my video was not here, then this information would not be as effective as it could be. Now, because you have narration, you don't want to violate that redundancy principle. So, as you can see in this presentation, the text that I'm using is pretty basic, so it's not a direct transcript of what I'm saying, and it's not completely distracting. Next, we have pictures and words are greater than only words. So I have some professors who are like, time is money, space on this slide, I need to make it count. I don't have time for any kind of infographics and pictures. It needs to be paragraphs of text, and I need to write all of it down for notes. I understand, but you could also divide information into separate slides and have images that correlate specifically to what you're talking about. And that will actually be more effective for your students because that's a visual that will help them remember and connect an image to things that they're actually hearing. And then images are greater than talking heads. There's still research going on this, but my suggestion would be to have, if you're in a lecture, especially a recorded one, kind of like my presentation here, have your video with you talking about the information, but also have a visual component, even if it's just images as you're talking or slides, because a combination of the two is really going to give those cues to your students to help them better process and lower the cognitive load. Talking about design, here's a couple things that are simple but also very effective. And the first one is contrast. And this is a little bit of a focus on accessibility, but even for your average bear, you need contrast, or else you can't really easily see what's going on. You shouldn't have to search for the information. You don't want a white background with a neon yellow text that's going to be hard to read. You want enough contrast where things and elements stick out on purpose. And if you're having to squint and there's different design issues that are located in the multimedia, again, that's more cognitive load and mental processing for your students that they shouldn't have to deal with. We want to minimize that as much as possible. The next is font. So the font chosen on this slide is a disaster. I know that a lot of educators would love to, kind of have a little bit of creativity, and we don't want to stick with the Times New Roman and I don't want my slides to look really boring. Just be aware of your font. Make sure it's easy to read, because if they're sitting here trying to figure out if that's the letter F, the letter T, or the number 7 in this word font, then again, they're processing more than they should have to. And that's going to take away from the actual content. Next is size. I've seen this go both ways. I've seen presentations that have really, really large font and then also really, really small font. And it depends on the method of delivery as well. Consider how large the screen is. If you are presenting something in person and you know how large your projector displays text, then take that into consideration. If students are potentially viewing multimedia on their, let's say, mobile devices, it's going to be a lot smaller. So keeping those in mind is going to, again, limit that extraneous processing. And then theme. If you notice, most of my colors here and my format and my pictures, it has a consistent theme throughout, so it's not distracting. If something does stand out, that would be for signaling purposes. Because if we have every single slide or every single page of our multimedia is completely different and there's not a visual and mental flow, that's going to stick out as things that are signaling, and it's going to make students look at these different aspects when really it's not the most important information on the slide. And then on the bottom, I have alignments. I don't know if some of you are like me, but if there is a slide where the alignment's off, or every single line had a bullet point except for one, or there's 3 different images, but they're not all aligned in the top, or it's not even, those things will stick out. And again, that's more mental processing that the students will encounter that we just want to avoid right off the bat. Next for design is the voice principle. And it's been proven that the more approachable and personable the lecture is, or let's say the narration behind a video, the more effective it is for students. If you have a straight up robotic voice, and there are some text-to-speech software that some people use for their videos, just know that's going to be less effective for your learners and potentially very distracting for them versus just you talking, because that's going to be something that they're used to. It's not going to stand out as signaling as something different. And also for design, make sure you have some space. You don't want things to be overlapping. You don't need 500 images to display what you're talking about. And none of these images are connected. They're covering up words. And just by looking at this slide, if it didn't have the word design on it, I would not be able to tell you what this slide is about. That's a lot of extraneous processing for students. Consider your negative space. Negative space, which is blank areas, they're not a bad thing. It's literally giving your mental cues a break so it can organize the information mentally. A few notes here. Consider giving some note-taking time. During our lectures as educators, we tend to kind of zip through the information because I've seen this information 500 times, or maybe I think I would write faster than my students do. So be aware of that whenever you're going in between different sections of your information. The segmenting principle talks about basically chunking your information down into smaller pieces. So if we can either use hierarchy with different bullet points and different levels of headings, if we could use less information on each slide and just have more slides, or you could separate your information into different modules. So if you have an e-learning module, you could have sub-modules that students could view and take notes over, interact with. And by segmenting, it's going to mentally help them divide the information in their mind. And then also relevance. I know as educators, we can get really excited about some kind of new tool that we found, or this really cool video that we found on YouTube. But sometimes, and I've been guilty of this myself, I loved the design and the modern feel and the animations. It didn't seem like an educational video from the 1980s. And I was so excited to use it. I was like, well, there's one section of this video that covers things that we're not going to talk about, so I'm just going to tell my students to ignore it. You want to make sure that whatever you choose or design for multimedia in your course, it needs to directly be relevant to your information. So maybe you need to redesign something if you changed information in your course. Or maybe you need to look at a different video if the one that you really, really liked on YouTube actually has information that's not directly covered in your course. Accessibility, we touched a little bit on this earlier, but make sure you have transcripts that are available, subtitles that are available, different heading levels instead of just changing your font size in case students are using a screen reader. And also having multimedia that is printable will be helpful as well. Consider developing or using multimedia that is device adaptive. A lot of times students are using their mobile phones now to interact with their courseware. And if your course is designed for a laptop, that's fine. But if students viewing the course information on their devices are having to scroll all over, maybe the text is half cut off so they can't read all the instructions, etc., that's going to cause an issue. Consider updates. So you might have a really cool e-module you used last year, but maybe you've changed your course since then. So you need to consider what updates you need to make to your multimedia to always make sure that you're improving it and it's accurate and relevant to your course. And then we want to minimize distractions. This goes into the coherence principle. If you don't have to have it, if it is not directly relating information from the text to the video, if it is extraneous information, get rid of it. The less, the better. Because again, we want to lower the cognitive load of our students. We want to minimize that multitasking. And if we have 500 things all over the slides, remember their eyes are going to be all over the place. So instead of giving the information their full attention, everything on the slide is going to get a little bit of their attention, and that knowledge is not going to be retained. All right, in summary, we're basically talking about text, graphics, and audio. Remember, signaling is going to cue your students onto what is most important on the slide, e-module, video, or whatever multimedia that you're using. That signaling gives them a heads up on, hey, I need to focus on certain parts, or organizing the lesson in their head, and they can take notes accordingly. Next is a contiguity principle, where you want to have things located in places that make sense. So if you have an image that's depicting what is described in the text that says step 1, obviously you want to make sure those are together so it makes sense and isn't distracting for your students. You also want to make sure that your narration actually matches up with your slides, or else that's going to be like a foreign film where you're looking at subtitles in English and it's very distracting. Then we had the redundancy principle, and that's where we talked about cognitive load. And we want to make sure we're not overloading our students in those 3 different channels where we're seeing things and hearing things, interacting with the multimedia, and listening to narrations with corresponding text on the screen. That's simply going to be too much. So just remember that they have working memory, and that's what we're using whenever we're getting new information in class. And whenever you have that working memory, it's limited. So once you fill that cup, they're not going to learn anything anymore. And then looking at the design of your multimedia, how are we using our text and images? Are things aligned? Are things designed with contrast so they're easy to see, they're easy to read? We don't have overlapping information and a lack of negative space. All these things are going to go into making your multimedia better for students to actually absorb the information, to organize that information, and then have better knowledge recall afterwards. And that is how we look at multimedia and analyze the different principles to make sure that's actually going to be effective for our students in their learning, both in the classroom and online.